Hi, and welcome to Talking Wildfires with Michael Hill. Today I have somebody really interesting here who I would like you to meet. This is David Packham, and David Packham is a father to aerial burning processes. And David was the epicenter of an original idea. And I'll have David tell you the story of where it all came from because I think you guys, like for me, will be fascinated by this story. And this is our chance to meet David Packham. Here he is. David, can you tell us the story of how the PLDO capsule came to be?
Yes, Mike. Now everything is connected to everything else in this world, and so I won't go into the background which got me this to the stage where we needed to find a safe incendiary to use from aircraft, because that goes right back to my almost childhood and chemistry and things that start burning. Um Usually on purpose. Now, the West Australians had really worked out that the only way you can manage wildfire in Australia, because of our fire-loving eucalypts, uh, was to actually burn the forest before the bad seasons come and before the fuels got too heavy. And they became very, very good at it. In fact, in my view, the best in the world. And they had a urban pine plantation, Pinus pinaster it was, in the suburbs of Perth, which was a very valuable one, and it was actually owned by the University of West Australia. But there were a lot of fire ignitions there. The mostly by accident. Sometimes, well, the funniest thing was at a conference when they had to tell where the fires came from, and they said that one of the greatest causes was the post-coital cigarette, and that caused a bit of an uproar, and sort of stuck in one's mind. Um, and so they decided that they were going to burn it. And George Pete worked out all the science to actually do the burn, but the trees were very valuable because they were headed for very, very high quality veneer, and they did not want fire scars on the trees. So we knew a lot about heat and mass transfer inside flame mantles in fires and prescribed burns. We've done a fair bit of measurements in those. And we knew that if we could wrap the trees in aluminium foil, then that would protect them and they would not end up with fire scars. That failed dramatically because the flames chimneyed up between the foil and the tree and made sure that the trees were damaged. So we recovered from this and were saved embarrassment by the fact that it started to rain, and the experimental fire, which was on about an acre or so, uh, was terminated. Well, the head of this of fire research in Western Australia was George B. Peat, and he was the author of the West Australian so-called Red Book, which tells you after about 60 years of research how you go about prescribed burning in our eucalypt forests, and it is an absolutely brilliant guide. Then we discussed what their issues were, and the major issue at that stage was that the fact that in their karri forests, which are a wet sclerophyll forest down south of West Australia, they had been doing some prescribed burning with strips and very frequent ignitions, spot ignitions, very precise, so that the fires would join together at about sunset, when the fire behaviour drops off, and the fires maintained a very modest, mild behaviour. Well, in doing that, two of their forest workers were entrapped and were killed. And this concerned them a lot. And George, who, if any of your listeners know what a koala bear looks like, and I bet they do, and if they could imagine what a koala bear would sound if it talked, it would sound like George Peet. Well, George said, Packham, our real problem is that it's too dangerous to light these spot fires inside the Karri forests. And suddenly in my mind flashed back what happened with a young chemist who was making little incendiaries around the place for fun. These are good things. This is safe because the fuel, which was the glycol, it was separate from the oxidizing agent, which was in this case potassium permanganate, until they were joined together, and 30 seconds later the reaction took place. Now this turned out to be an extraordinarily safe way of doing it. In CSIRO in Australia, CSIRO was our major governmental research organisation that was at that stage pretty tops, and they had workshop capacities where we were that could do things that nobody else in the world could do, and that is that's where atomic absorption spectroscopy was developed, and you needed some very careful engineering. So they made a very safe distribution system that could be used in an aircraft. Now I've had a lifetime which is now finished, I'm afraid. Not the lifetime, but my interest in aviation has been forced to finish because of age. And so I was capable of understanding where aircraft could be used in this situation. Then, to our aid, we shared our research area in Fisherman's Bend, which was a very big wartime establishment in Australia, with the Aeronautical Research Laboratories, which were in the Department of Defence. And they had a group of people who were expert in aviation and precision aviation, and they came and helped us and showed us how to fly aircraft in very, very straight lines at low levels. And so 4 marks to the West Australians who said, all right, this looks like it might work, go and do it. So we got the incendiaries, we got the prescribed burning guide, which George Peet was the world's expert in, and away we went. And the first series of experiments that we did in Western Australia worked extremely well. The fires were modest, they reduced the fuel, no damage was done, and 3 years later we could go back and have a look and say the forest has, its biodiversity had definitely improved. In other words, that particular combination of the forestry people, the aviation people, the chemistry bit, and the meteorological side meant that effectively the forest fire problem was solved in Australia, at least in Western Australia, because the eastern status, I don't know, it might be a bit like America. The difference between the West and the East could be quite substantial in terms of culture. The eastern status did not believe that anything useful could come out of the West. And so they have, up to now, pretty well refused to apply the solution to the Australian forest problem. Now, in this burning, we generated a few side effects, shall we call them. One was the environmental issue of having aerial burning amounting to somewhere around about 10 to 15% of the forest area each year. In other words, no forest became more than 8 years old in terms of fuel build-up, and they all averaged about 3 to 4 years, and that fixes the problem. I can prove that if anybody wants to argue that issue. So we were physical scientists, and so we didn't want to get involved in the biological, ecological things. And however, that became a bit clear that we didn't really have to, because other people had pretty well tackled the problem. I see you've got a whole bunch of kangaroos on the picture behind you, and that is involving fire, and that really brought home to us the fact that Indigenous people for tens of thousands of years had reached a stage that we should attempt to go to if we can. And it was done in Western Australia, but they refused to do it over east. So we're going to have a Prestigo fire over here one year, and they'll change their mind then. Now, the other thing, that the other side effect, it produced a large quantity of smoke. One of our experimental fires in Western Australia closed the Perth International Airport for 2 days. We became very, very unpopular, because if you have a look at Perth, it's about the most remote big city in the world. And if you have just had hours in the air from Singapore, you don't want to end up in Sydney as an alternate. So we had to really take the smoke issue very quietly, very carefully. We were in the division of physical chemistry, which became the division of applied chemistry, and we had all the absolute world state-of-the-art chemical facilities available to us. And so mass spectrometry, X-ray diffraction, it was all there. So we thought smoke is a wonderful thing for chemists to play with. And so we did. And we undertook, I think by that stage, about 4 of us undertook about 10 years of research into prescribed burning smoke and the characteristics. Well, that led to a lot of very interesting things too, which NASA gave us a bit of a help. At Houston, I had visited Houston, and they had from their orbits, they had photographs of smoke plumes. And would you believe, in Australia, whether it happens anywhere else in the world, I've got no idea. But in Australia, to our amazement, the remote fires we have in Australia, and north of the tropic, about 46% of the savanna forests burn each year. There's plenty of smoke plumes to look at, and they all turned out to be spreading out at approximately 12.5 degrees. Now, this meant that we could aim fairly accurately where our smoke was going to be a nuisance. And also another big interesting discovery there was that the photochemical reactions, and I did visit the Air Pollution Control Laboratory in Los Angeles, who were the leaders in photochemical smog. And what we were doing was generating photochemical smog, but only in the top of the column, which produced a UV filter so that people under prescribed burning smoke, of which Darwin, right up the north of Australia, which gets a lot of smoke each year, their capacity to receive biologically active UV leading to skin cancers is much, much less than right down at the south of Australia in Hobart, because the smoke from prescribed burning filters it out. So lots of things sort of popped out of this, including we had to make a device that would measure smoke very sensitively. And it had happened that during the Second World War, the British were interested in the visibility through the atmosphere, and for anti-aircraft purposes, and they had generated an instrument which at that stage was pretty primitive, called a nephelometer, or cloud measurer. Now, this nephelometer we worked at, the atomic absorption spectroscopy, which I mentioned before, meant that there were electronics people who could work at very small light detection levels, and we built a nephelometer. That, for one reason or another, we trialled for fire alarm systems in very high value buildings. So that led to a thing called the VESDA, which I was the original inventor of, according to the patent, but there's always teams working with you. And that VESDA, for example, has totally revolutionized fire detection in places like the White House, the Vatican. Almost every hospital now built will have a VESDA detector, and it's now the rights belong to Honeywell. So that has all popped out of a little capsule that was designed to make prescribed burning safe. These things all connect with each other. And that's about it, but there's lots of other fun details that one could go on with, but well, I'll try and keep to the point.
David, I have a question for you. I understand in Australia that Roger Underwood was also a major pioneer in aviation and prescribed burning. Can you describe how he fit into the picture and his connection with everything?
Well, very simply, Roger Underwood was George Pete's boss. And so everything that George Pete did had to be approved by Roger. Roger wasn't so enthusiastic in the very early stages, but he very quickly came around, and he has been by far the most logical proponent of fire management in West Australia. But he doesn't get much support from his peers, I'm afraid, who have gone down the extremely green, all fire is bad path, which fortunately, and again, Alan King was the first person to publish a paper on the sophistication of the Indigenous people in Australia with fire. His publication starts off, one of the early references is Captain James Cook and Banks and all these, Matthew Flinders and all these sorts of people. But it is open and shut that the sophistication of the Indigenous people over 60-odd thousand years has led to a fire management capability, intellectual capability, that has now, unfortunately, is disappearing rapidly in the southern parts of Australia. It's going quite well up in the north of the tropics. It's still alive there, but by and large, our Indigenous people have lost their capability, and there are not enough of them to actually deal with the problem. So we just had to do it by aircraft to really do an industrial version of what the Indigenous people did. But it's all the same. Mild fires, which must not harm the crowns because that's where the ancestors live. And fire, like water, should travel gently over the surface. And that's some quotations from our possibly leading Indigenous fire person, Victor Stephenson, here in Australia.
Well, that's great. Thank you for your time and explaining this to us. It's fascinating, and we all appreciate the opportunity to get to meet you on video. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
We're doing this for all of you. If you like what we're doing, please give us a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button, and leave a comment below. See you next time.